About 25 centuries ago, a young Indian prince renounced the world and renounced his own throne in order to become a philosopher. The cause behind his action was obvious. India was in trouble. There was feuding and fighting and war, jealousy between rulers, and the Hindu religion into which he was born was suffering from a series of desperate perversions. The more sincere followers of the faith were neglected, ignored, and persecuted, and worldly ambitions ran very high. In this emergency, Prince Siddhartha became convinced that there must be a straight and proper way to live. And because of the conditions we are in today, his ideas and his philosophies seem to have very special continuing interest and value to us. Some ways, in looking over his teachings, it would seem that he was a contemporary with us. He had the same problems, and he approached them in the most thoughtful way, a way that perhaps will intrigue or influence a great deal of modern thinking, if it is given the chance to do so. Studying the condition of man, Prince Siddhartha began to develop a series of internal solutions to problems based upon one simple concept, namely, his definition or discussion of the nature of deity. He said, if God does not prevent evil, he is not good. And if God cannot prevent evil, he is not God. Something had to explain the condition of the world without blaming it on mysterious factors and forces abiding in space. Buddha, as he became more generally known, had the concept that it was necessary for the human being to reorganize his concepts concerning life, that he must sometime face the problem of his own destiny himself, instead of leaving it to others or future ages, or depending upon past times. Each person must work out his own salvation with diligence. Because of this attitude, many people of Asia and also many missionaries from the West assumed that Buddha was an atheist because he did not follow the traditional form of casting the burdens upon the Lord. He felt that it was about time for the human being to face himself. He was probably dramatically correct, but it took a long time for the world to realize what he meant. And there is still only a few who sense the magnitude of the conviction that he gave the world. To begin with, then, Buddha advanced what he called the four great truths. And these four truths, or four realities, or four facts, are the problem of the cause of suffering, the nature of suffering, the end of suffering, and the way to find the end of suffering. To Buddha, the great burden of the world was pain. Not necessarily just physical pain, but spiritual pain, moral pain, mental pain, emotional pain. Suffering, the burden of all that is born, the yoke that all must wear, and this strange, mysterious negation which intrudes itself in every moment of human life. In the moment of great joy, pain is near. In the moment of success, failure is near. Why must man face suffering of some kind through the entire period of his life? I think Buddha would have answered that in this way, that the human being has never been educated to prevent suffering. He has been given all kinds of ways to try to get over it if possible, usually ineffectively. He has never recognized the fact that suffering is a symbol. It is not a symbol of the fact that deity dislikes him. It is not a symbol of the tyrannies of nature. To Buddha, suffering was the symbol of the ignorance of man himself. That he is the cause of his own suffering, collectively and individually. And it is necessary for him to correct this cause if he is to liberate the world from pain and misery. The great sufferings are war, pestilence, natural disasters. The smaller sufferings are physical pains, emotional stress, broken homes, wayward children, poverty, disease. All these are forms of suffering, and they all arise within man himself. If the human being had devoted as much time to the solution of his own internal problems as he has devoted to the extension of his material environment, he would be in far better condition than he is today. We explore space. The Brahmins were exploring it long ago. We send spaceships out. We go into laboratories with all kinds of chemical devices. We create computers and engines and machines. But suffering goes on because the individual has not been taught the mystery of his own nature. He has not been given the courage to correct the mistakes in his own conduct. Of course, while Buddha lived a long time ago, there was a long time before he came. And from the past, he gained certain instruction and inspiration, even as we do today if we are thoughtful. He realized that conditions have gone on the simple basis that whatever happens has to happen. There may be no reason for it. A tyrant arises, it's too bad. But there has always been tyranny. Wars come, it is regrettable. But there have always been wars. Man has always been fighting to win a war, not to prevent one. If he had put as much energy, money, and time into securing the peace, he would have been in a much better condition. Buddha pointed that out when he talked to the East Indian generals 2,500 years ago. Also, Buddha pointed out that all these wars and confusions and conflicts and disagreements and political misunderstandings have had very little effect upon the boundaries of nations. Down in modern times, World War II cost over 50 million lives. And yet today, the boundaries are much the same. No great achievement was made. No great problem was solved. All this, and then a little quiet and another war. What are we doing? Why are we continuously destroying our own peace of mind? And Buddha, looking it over very thoughtfully and carefully, came to a philosophical conclusion. We must realize that in its original form, Buddhism was not a religion. Buddhism was an ethical and moral philosophy, a way of life. And this way of life included a concept of veneration for the divine plan of things. But Buddha was not primarily a religionist. He was primarily an ethical reformer with a very profound insight into the nature of the human being, possibly one of the deepest insights the world has ever known. So he began his study of the problem by attempting to define the nature of suffering. What is it? He said that there are numerous causes of suffering, but all of these causes are subject to remedy. They are subject to correction before the suffering sets in. There are many, many ways in which we attempt to solve problems, but until we reach a realization of the basic facts of things, we will not solve the problems. The basic facts lie inside of each one of us. These basic facts are very powerful in the lives of some and may cause them to be very dangerous people. In others, these facts of life are simply partly present, and these persons are less dangerous and more reformable. But in every instance, the cause lies inside of the person, and from there it spreads outward, contaminating other persons. And when a whole group of contaminated individuals form the population of a nation, the nation is contaminated. Its projects are undermined, and those who are of nobler person and mind are disposed of because they interfere with the private ambition of those who have badly organized internal motive patterns. So, to begin with, suffering begins when the individual allows attitudes and appetites to interfere with common sense. Common sense, the most uncommon of the senses, has to do with the person's reaction to circumstances. There are very few persons whose actions do not result in consequences which these persons do see, do face, do know about, but do not correct. Therefore, in the beginning of suffering is an unreasonable, impractical, unenlightened relationship with the world around us and with the life within us. It has been there always. Some say it is due to ignorance. Now, there are two kinds of ignorance: simple ignorance and complex ignorance. Simple ignorance is the ignorance of the savage and the child. Complex ignorance is far more difficult to work with. It is ignorance which arises not from necessity, but from the unwillingness to face the restrictions of self. It is a kind of educated ignorance which results from being taught the wrong things and having education deprived of every factor that could result in a mature, educated person. Now, we must remember that 2,000 years ago in India, we did not have the situation that we have there now. The great University of Nalanda was one of the highest educational structures on earth, with a student body of over 25,000 and over 1,000 professors. And in the University of Nalanda, Christianity was taught as comparative religion. Things happened. The ancient world of classical Asia was destroyed. Wars and pestilences, most of them due to the abuse of natural resources, came in, decimated and depleted the people. But it was not necessary that this should happen. It was necessary to face up to these problems rather than to allow them to accumulate forever. Now, we all know, and Buddha knew, that reforming other people is probably the world's most unrewarding effort. Also a very dangerous one. But to start by improving our own natures is very important, because one of the principles of Indian philosophy, both Hindu and Buddhist, is that the individual, being a transient being, having only a few years in this world, should be more concerned with following and obeying nature than he is adjusting to human society. It is good to be adjusted, but the individual who compromises his principles in order to achieve a measure of success here is making a mistake, because he is not going to be here long enough for his measure of success to be meaningful, and he is going to depart from here with a bad burden of unfinished business. Actually, therefore, the problem sums up in a very simple way. How is the person going to understand first the nature of suffering? Buddha tells us that suffering is a very definite part of all existence, that it is caused by selfishness and ignorance. Now, selfishness is injuring yourself or others for gain. Ignorance is being instructed wrongly or not receiving the educational advantages that have descended to us from the past. Now, the educational advantages of the past are not necessarily carefully recorded in our educational institutions. When it comes to knowing the wisdom of the past, history is better than education, because history shows us our mistakes, and education tries to prove to us that that which was a mistake was not a mistake. That the real success is to keep on making the same mistakes, but making them with greater scientific assistance. Just one more step of scientific assistance, and we may not be here to make mistakes. We have not learned. So Buddha says the beginning of suffering is ignorance and selfishness. Ignorance, being improperly educated, not being taught what is true, being prepared to build a career around selfishness. So that the combination of education inspiring selfishness results in suffering. Suffering is wherever we use natural resources unwisely or without consideration for the common good. Selfishness causes us to try to monopolize resources. Such monopoly may make a few dollars in profit, but ends in suffering. The individual who tries to exploit his neighbor gains a little profit, but in the end contributes to suffering. Every action which is contrary to integrity causes suffering on the person who commits it and on others. Now, Buddha pointed out, however, one redeeming point in this, that while our mistakes bring suffering to ourselves, it does not necessarily follow that others will be injured. The only reason why others are injured is because they more or less agree with our mistakes. They think that success, as we have it, is desirable for them also, and that they in turn are likely, through self-interest, to buy the mistakes that we sell them. And as a result, suffering comes to them. Actually, each individual has a right to refrain from the causes of suffering within himself. And temptation is a form of having someone else try to convince you that you should do certain things for motives of self-interest. Where this happens, trouble comes. So the broad point of suffering is that it is the result of breaking the simple rules of life. And these rules cannot be broken without suffering. The idea that we can reconstruct the universe closer to our heart's desire, this idea is false. We have no power to control or master that which extends through the vast reaches of infinity. The space that goes on forever cannot be dominated by the human mind. What we call conquering it simply means to stick a probe in it and try to see what's there. We cannot conquer it. We cannot master it. And it's a case of trying to break rules and suffering, or deciding to keep rules and removing, step by step, the causes of suffering. If then we are concerned with this matter, Buddha gives us a series of examples, all of which indicate, before we get through with it, that the source of suffering within ourselves is emotional or mental or both. The mind is the cause of most suffering. It is assumed to be an infallible instrument, and it is not. The mind can make any mistake that we want it to make. It is a hired servant of our own whims. It obeys whatever will we bestow upon it. And it tries to help us to fulfill the schemes which have already dominated our consciousness. The emotions also constitute a tremendous pressure, a pressure for gratification of appetites of all kinds. And in gratification of these appetites, we compromise integrity. Everywhere we go, no one or very few people have become wise enough to know that they cannot be dishonest without pain, and that gradually the pain becomes unbearable. And yet they go to the grave with the pain and the dishonesty both intact. This is because we haven't been willing to accept, on a scientific level, that which was obvious to the ancients for thousands of years and is being repeatedly demonstrated to us every day of our contemporary lives. And yet there is only one consideration, and that is profit. As long as a person is willing to sell his own soul for $1, he is going to know pain, and plenty of it, because he cannot compromise the integrities within himself without physical suffering, or the integrities of his thoughts and emotions without mental and emotional suffering. Buddha was very clear on these points, and I don't think anyone has ever been able to refute him, because the obvious consequences of action are too definite. A second stamp is, of course, we know that suffering exists. Now we can begin to analyze how it operates. Therefore, we say, what is suffering, and what is the cause of suffering? For example, a man devotes his life to accumulating wealth, and he succeeds. And having accumulated wealth, he feels that he has fulfilled his own destiny. But this man is already in trouble. By the time he has accumulated the wealth, the suffering has already started, and there's no way of avoiding it. In the first place, as Buddha said, the man who has is forever living in the fear of loss. Someone is going to take away from him that which he has. And by taking it away from him will result in great anguish of nature for him, for the reason that he has put his happiness in his pocketbook. Who steals that makes him a beggar indeed. Now the other man, faced with the problem of money, doesn't succeed in accumulating the fortune. So he is miserable because he has not the money. The man who has it is afraid of losing it. The man who has not got it is miserable because he can't get it. And nothing is happy anywhere in the picture. It just keeps right on going. Now the ambition to have is not only leading us to the problem of a society which wishes to rob us of what we have on the slightest provocation, and puts us in the spot of inflation and all the problems of finances that we have today with unstable dollars, the world economy upside down, the unemployment rising. All of this is part of the byproduct of a false ambition in the first place. We have done it wrong from the beginning. We have made error glamorous. We have made certain procedures satisfying to the selfishness in ourselves. And when the castle we have built falls down, we are all miserable, and we look around trying to figure out who caused it, and finally lay the blame upon the devil, which he has been blamed for so many things, however, that I guess he can stand the burden better than we can. But how does it happen that for 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 years, back into the time of Egypt, we have followed such a pattern, fully aware that it won't work, fully aware that the price of what we have is too great for what we get out of it, and nobody changes. Still that hope, that gamble, that belief that we, in ourselves, will be happy with that which has made all others miserable, or that we alone are miserable because we have not got what all others are seeking. So here is a problem of suffering. And in the gaining of this today, we find that the complication of accumulation is itself a great cause of suffering in many ways. We are having more and more coronaries in middle life for successful business people. The constant struggle to accumulate, the constant effort to outwit the competitor, these are working a terrible hazard upon our healths, upon our dispositions, and upon all the personal values of living. They are impoverishing our lives, damaging our homes, and wrecking our bodies. And yet it's all in the great cause. We want to be, if possible, the richest man in the family graveyard. This is our great joy. Buddha also points out that if we work like this for a whole lifetime, getting it, and we finally do get it, and it's cost us everything else beside that which we determined to get, then in the midst of all this, we wrap the curtains of our couch about us and lie down and die. We don't even live long enough to enjoy a part of what we have done. We have sacrificed life and never lived to make the sacrifice worthwhile. If we were going to live 500 years with the wealth, it might seem more useful or more reasonable to do things. But in the midst of accumulation, we drop down and out. And all that we have worked for with a lifetime, from the beginning of our schooling to the day of our death, is left behind. Why then should we make this world miserable and ourselves miserable to get something that we cannot live long enough to use? And if we do not use it, we leave it to others who haven't earned it, who either lose it or abuse it. And their story I've told of the old Roman who, after he was dead, used to sit as a ghost in his house and watch his children squander his funds. It would be a very unhappy experience, but it is the only experience.
no matter what we leave behind, someone will ultimately abuse it, even if we leave it to an institution. The institution will change in the course of time. There is no solution. So we are following a will-o'-the-wisp, and in the sense of accumulation, we have gradually built up a world of competition leading to war, crime, and all kinds of misdemeanors, and we have to sit in the midst of this. The thief has to be afraid that he will be robbed in turn. There is no safety in anything. Yet the world keeps right on going. Our great codes do not correct the situation. Our great universities do not help young people to find out what is valuable and necessary. No one is interested in the ingredients of natural and simple happiness. Everyone wants gain and profit and thinks of happiness in terms of accumulations rather than in terms of internal maturity. So Buddha was pretty much right in assuming that we, somewhere in the remote time of things, headed civilization in the wrong direction. And no matter how much we have talked and fought, no matter how many great reformers and heroes have arisen among us, we have not been able to get progress back on the track. It is as though we had built a Grand Canyon of the Colorado, starting as a little dribble of water in the wrong direction, and now hopelessly locked within a canyon more than a mile deep. It's the same way with all these things that we do. We cannot accomplish peace because it interferes with our success or somebody else's success. We cannot reform without being subject to martyrdom. Everything is locked within a process that is going nowhere. And with nuclear fission at our doorstep, Buddha's statements have a new and tremendous validity, namely, that the future of our own survival is in our own hands. Now, Buddhism has one factor which it took from Hinduism, which has had an important bearing on this, and that is the doctrine of reincarnation. Reincarnation is a combination of hope and further fear. It is hope in the sense that it gives us more time to make the adjustments. But it also carries the factor of fear because it has the law of consequence locked in it. Namely, that as we have lived and as we have earned, so it will be paid. Therefore, we are all under a certain responsibility for the outcome of conduct. The immediate karmic reaction of most mistakes is right here in this world, where we see these mistakes bringing suffering. But there are long-range mistakes that do not solve themselves so easily. And the most important of these is our own human character. We can leave behind, for a while at least, some of the consequences of our unthoughtful conduct. But we must take the imperfection of our own natures with us and be prepared to come back and do it again, unless the enlightenment and change of realization occurs within ourselves. So Buddha sets out the pattern that each individual is capable of an adjustment that will last forever, an improvement which will add to the eternal growth of his own nature. Suffering does not produce growth directly. Suffering is growing the hard way. Suffering is the individual learning from his mistakes. But there is a direct way of growth in which the individual can learn from having done things well. And this form of growth is painless. The reward of right action is just as real and powerful as the penalty for wrong action. Each person has to work this out in his own nature. So in every way, Buddha ties up the difficulties of our time. Indigestion has something to do with international relationships. The probability that the person is going to have a coronary is due to conditions in which society, being benighted, impels him to follow a wrong example. There seems to be nothing short of a universal reformation that can change this. But Buddha also realized that the talk of universal reformation is a difficult conversation. It has too much in it. Therefore, the person, having only control of himself, must work first upon himself and try to liberate himself from that which is abnormal and unnatural. He also makes a very interesting observation, directly or indirectly through his ahats, namely that actually so few people are interested really in growth that there is not much competition in that field. No one is going to blame us if we take away from them nothing that they value. And yet in growing, we all grow and add up a great treasure of growth without anyone else in the world being poorer. Growth is the one great asset that is non-competitive. It is something that we can become wiser and wiser, but no one else will be injured unless we pervert that wisdom. So there is really no one who is going to really stand in our way and hate us simply because we try to be better. Of course, we have to be a little careful about it because we mustn't tell them our intention. If we go around telling people that we're trying to be better, we will either be ridiculed or persecuted. But if in our conduct we are better, they will all benefit from it also. So there is very little danger to those who live well, but there is great danger to those who talk about living well. If we do it ourselves, there is a very good way of meeting the problem. So we then come to the last and most important step in Buddha's doctrine, the noble truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering. This is the reason for the rise of the Sangha, as it was called in Buddhism, or the fellowship, the assembly of the devout. This was a group of persons who were determined in themselves to live well. Buddhism has never produced any form of religious hierarchy that is comparable to other religions. It does not tell the individual that he must obey certain other persons, or that there is a vast structure that he must not vary from. The Buddhist Sangha is an assembly of persons who are determined in their own lives and in their daily actions to educate themselves in value, that they will really do the things that are necessary to bring security to themselves and improve the general state of human existence. Now, the noble truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering is the gradual transformation, reclamation, and adjustment of the mental, emotional complex within the individual. Unless we rectify the individual in his own life, we cannot bring an end to suffering. No one can make another person good, but each person can become good in his own right if he so desires. He can gradually weed out those dangerous attitudes and habits which contribute to suffering. He can do all kinds of small things every day to rescue his point of awareness from the wrong objectives. he can begin to think in terms of the Socratic moderation, for example. He will learn gradually that moderation in living in this world minimizes suffering, that immoderation maximizes it. The individual who lives the simple life makes fewer mistakes. The person who complicates his life with ulterior motives makes many mistakes. Therefore, in the Buddhist philosophy, simplicity is the key to the good life. Simplicity is the individual who is not as much concerned over what he has as he is over what he is as a human being. If value comes first, the value is in himself. There is not enough wealth in all the world to prevent misery. No individual can have so much of anything that he is free from danger and free from suffering. Today, if he has very much, he is going to be subject to mugging and burglarizing. The whole world is trying to tell him something, trying to tell him that his objectives are wrong and that these objectives are contributing to the creation of crime in society. So Buddha talked about the simple way, the Noble Eightfold Path, which leads to the perfection of all things in the law of life. This path is moderation in all appetites and the gradual simplifying of ambitions and their transformation into aspirations. The individual dreaming about being more in terms of value rather than having more. The most that the individual can ever possess in this world is himself. All other things are intangible. And he can only take with him what he is. What he has remains for others to waste. The more simple his life, the more likely he is to move quietly along the path of years, and will free his mind and his heart for those labors which are profitable in terms of growth. All the success in the world is not as important to help as the ability to make a friend and be a friend. Friendship is a greater treasure than can ever be put in a bank balance. But we do not realize this, and we have great trouble because of the banks and because of the system and because that's the way it's done. But how it happens that we have built a great system all over this world, drawing in not only the more powerful nations, but the unfolding and growing nations, to become part of a fatal situation in which there is no consideration for value. Everything is in terms of profit. And every bit of profit today is measured in terms of loss. So we are not getting there. Now, that somebody 2,500 years ago should point out why we're not getting there now is very interesting, especially as it is not directly involved with preachment as we know it. It is not a case of trying to ask forgiveness for our sins. It's a problem of outgrowing them by our own efforts. It puts growth largely with the person, but the reward of growth by the person is the unfoldment of the potentials of that person. The individual who wishes to face eternity with a good hope has got to build a good life to face it with. So in the terms of the path that leads to the end of suffering, we can quietly detach ourselves through thoughtfulness. Now, Buddhism is a way of thoughtfulness that is not based upon platitudes. We all hear people tell us what to do, and we usually resent them. We are particularly resentful and take refuge in the concept that they tell us what to do, but they're not doing it themselves, and therefore it doesn't mean anything. Maybe it does mean something, but we have a perfect way of rejecting it because the other person isn't fulfilling his own philosophy. But in Buddhism, you do not have this situation at all, because you do not derive authority from other individuals. You derive authority from the one immutable source of authority, nature itself. You learn from living, not being told how to live, but seeing the consequences of your own living. You grow by watching the results of your own action. You unfold because you gradually become aware that it is necessary, not because someone else tells you. You discover the importance of the golden rule, because when you have broken it time after time, you have suffered. So that the final authority in the struggle against suffering is to estimate the consequences of suffering on your own flesh. Of course, you can broaden the scheme a little bit and observe how action similar to yours by other persons is bringing them suffering. You can gradually come to realize that there are rules, there is a way of life that is acceptable to nature, and nature will never give peace or happiness or friendship until its ways are accepted and followed. This is a very important discovery, but I like the part particularly that it is an experience pattern, that we are not forced to do something because the wise have told us to. We are not forced to do it because our faith demands it. We do it because we cannot survive any other way. And we are becoming increasingly weary of not surviving. We are not having what we should have from a world that can provide us with everything that we need, if, as individuals, we do not break the rules of nature and the rules of supply and demand. If we are willing to free ourselves from the terrible struggle of what we might term a materialistic culture, we will not only have better health, better homes, but we will also have a little time left to do something significant. We will have a time to sit down and read a good book. We will have time to go out and help a friend in trouble. We will have time to do many gracious things. But these gracious things are all being sacrificed on the altar of immediate utility. And as a result, we go along until we reach the end, and then perhaps a few hours before we depart, we begin to wonder what it's all about. It is not right for generation after generation of little ones to come into this world without some hope that they will receive the proper instruction necessary to give them a good and happy life. This is something we all have to work on if we expect it to happen. Now, in the course of this good and better and helpful life, there are rules also of things we have to do. One of the rules that Buddhism points out is that the individual, in order to gain the good of his own life, has to gradually take part in the labors of nature. Just as he must weed his own garden if he wants to raise vegetables, so he must help to weed life if he wishes to enjoy the beauties and niceties of existence. He has a community to consider, a community which is allowed to run down, go to pieces. He has a way of environment in neighborhood and in family and in friends, in which he can create gradually a greater amount of beauty, faith, insight, understanding, and security. So we are all gardeners in the world. We are none of us owners of anything. Buddha points that out very clearly in his thinking. We are not owners. We never have anything except a temporary leasehold. We are permitted to have things, but we cannot possess them. And now Buddha brings out the problem of wealth. He was not one of those who thinks we should take everything we have and distribute it among the poor. He said, this is not right because this is not the way nature does it. Nature distributes nothing but gives the individual the right to earn anything he wants. It is not to be bountiful that counts. And Buddha said, remember that it isn't the money. Money isn't anything except a medium of exchange. It isn't good. It isn't bad. It is no more significant in itself than a pebble on the beach or a shell in the ocean. It is not what you have. It is what you do with what you have. It's the attitude of possession. If you begin to think of wealth and money as possession, yours, to do with as you please, then gradually money becomes a curse. It becomes more and more of a curse when we give it an authority over life which it never is entitled to. Croesus in antiquity was said to have been the richest man who ever lived. And one day he showed his treasure house to a philosopher. And the philosopher said to him, Croesus, all that gold can be taken from you by a man with more iron. And it so happened. It is always the fact that wealth in itself is a great danger because it increases cupidities and contributes to conflict everywhere. If we had the concept within ourselves that Buddhism teaches, that wealth is something that at best is loaned to us. It is something that for a little time we are able to administer. But that in the administration of it, justice must be the first consideration. Justice with mercy, with love, with insight, and with unselfish understanding. Properly administered, wealth becomes a form of positive growth because it shows that the individual has transcended himself. But wealth dedicated to the advancement of individual projects at the cost of the common good is a sin and will lead to an inevitable accumulation of crimes. So it is not what we have, but what we do with it that determines whether we have peace or we have suffering. Every step of the way, there is a right use that brings peace. In every field of endeavor, there is a wrong use that ends in suffering. And we can't really solve this thing until we begin to estimate the universe in larger terms. Like Christianity, Buddhism had no cosmogony. Originally, Buddhism did not discuss the nature of the infinite or the vast concatenations of worlds. These concepts were in the keeping of the Brahmins, who were the great scientists of Asia. But gradually, with the passing of time, Buddhism divided into two great schools, one of which, the Theravada, or the school, we might say, of strict observances, moved southward in Asia and has its great centers in Thailand and in Lanka and these areas. The other system, the Mahayana, went northward into Tibet and China and finally into Japan and Korea. In this school, cosmogony is introduced from the Hindu, and the days of creation for the Mahayana school are measured much in the same way that Christianity measures creation from the book of Genesis. It was the background for a vast concept of life. Add to the Brahmins reincarnation, which they already taught, and karma. Add to that also the mathematical exactness of their calculations of the great cycles of space. Then add to that the law that we find in Buddhism of eternal progress towards infinite at-one-ment with reality. And you have a universe in which no one can afford to be selfish. The individual who, being a materialist, feels that when he passes from here, no one is going to care, and he is no longer going to know that he ever existed. This seems to be one end of suffering, oblivion. But to work as hard as he does, and use the faculties that he possesses, and bearing witness to a tremendous evolutionary background which has brought him to the present condition, and then assume that he is exterminated, is something the Eastern mind has a great deal of difficulty with. They cannot accept the idea that all this great growth, this tremendous pageantry of evolving life, not only here but in the evolution of stars and suns and galaxies, that all this means nothing, that has no purpose, no reality, and that everything is going to begin and end in the form of cosmic dust. They cannot accept this. So the philosophical systems and nations have always assumed that there is survival, and that survival is subject to certain penalties. In some religions, those who have been naughty, when they leave here, roast in perdition for an unlimited period of time. This concept has lost interest for most people. It is no longer believed. And even in the old days, where the beginnings of the belief can be traced, it was intended as symbolical. It was not intended to indicate a literal place. The individual is not intended to roast in perdition, but he must have a kind of purgatory which is perhaps even more painful in the long run. He must live with himself. He must face the consequences of his own conduct. He must become aware of the misery he has caused. He must realize also how he has frustrated his own growth, how he has destroyed a valuable experience pattern which should have made him a better person. Instead of that, has left him sorrier than before. So what we have thought of as purgatory or perdition is really the inevitable facing of self, the inevitable continuance of an unfinished business until we finish it. Plato pointed out that there could never be a perdition worse than here, that right here in this world is hell, and that all of us are come back to it until we learn to be better. But it is possible through integrity to transform hell itself. It is only bad because it is a place where we are required to face the consequences of our own conduct. As our own conduct changes, as our own consequences are regenerated, this world can be what it was intended to be. But in order to be a beautiful world, the beings that come back into it must have achieved within themselves a quality of integrity that makes it impossible for them to pervert or destroy the natural order of things. We have the right to make whatever we deserve and live in the results of our own conduct. So Buddhism, with the addition of reincarnation, and in the Northern School, gives us a great concept of life. A concept of life that in no way conflicts with modern astronomy, because it deals with a dimension which astronomy never touches. In fact, astronomy is apt to completely deny. It has to do with qualitative cosmogony. It has to do with the universe as experience, the universe as wisdom, as love, of strength and of beauty. It is a universe that science cannot touch, but to which it could also elevate itself if it so desired. There's no reason why the scientist could not be a great mystic or a great spiritual leader, because both the material and the spiritual are locked within himself. He is that which he has released at the present time. That which is yet to be released can cause him also to be not only a scientist, but a saint if he wants to be. So everywhere in this world there is this constant struggle to get hold of the values by means of which we can escape the tyrannies of circumstance. Also in this same thought, knowing the mind, as the Bhagavad Gita says, and no doubt Buddha read that in his own day, the mind is the slayer of the real. The mind is very largely responsible for the trouble. It is not responsible because it is bad. There's nothing bad about a mind. But a mind misused can be the most dangerous thing in all the world. A mind that is not refined and regenerated by love and friendship is completely a despot, a tyrant. And it leads the owner of that mind to destruction in almost every instance. There is nothing that adds more to the suffering of the individual than the misuse of his own mind. To recover from this misuse does not mean that the individual should cease to think, but he should begin to think in terms of value. He should think with the universe instead of against it. He should think of those things necessary to the common good and not those things which destroy the common good. The mind can be a magnificent and beautiful instrument. It can also be a terrible thing. And in the illumination of Buddha under the Bodhi tree, it is said that there was a kind of an atomic fission, a tremendous explosion of energy, of mind within him. It was the mind that became the universal energy and overcame the personal. Universal mind, more or less, was given the right to manifest through him. He gave it that right himself. Buddha never claimed to be an avatar, never claimed to be a god, never claimed to be an agent of God. Buddha never claimed to be anything but a simple human being who, looking around and seeing what was happening, thought something ought to be done about it. And in order to create his philosophy, he accepted nothing that was not demonstrable to him in the simple course of his own lifetime. For 80 years, he wandered the roads and paths of Bengal, and during that time he saw every type of experience of which the individual is capable of enduring. He saw birth, he saw growth, he saw death. He found all the different scenes and sights and symbols of human achievement and decay. He saw great palaces filled with misery. He saw hovels with joy and beauty. He saw the wise and the semi-wise and the unwise. He saw the sophisticate and the natural and simple childlike person. He experienced all of these things, and he had to fit it in, all of it, into one great comprehensive plan. A plan which man can intuit. A plan which man may not fully understand, but one thing he can understand. Namely, he knows when he breaks it. He knows when he does wrong. And from constantly learning what is wrong, he must ultimately gain the inner vision to know what is right. And he knows that what is right is harmless, that what is right protects every part of the person. And those who followed in his path, his arhats and their disciples, gradually reduced the power of pain and misery in themselves. There is a painting in the back of the lecture hall here on the nirvana of the Buddha, a Japanese rendering of an ancient Chinese painting. Here the master is lying on a couch of death surrounded by his disciples. The disciples are all sad, looking greatly deprived, except Ananda. Ananda is looking up through the sorrow of the others, smiling beautifully. Ananda knows the truth. And in that in itself we have the mystery of the loss of suffering due to the sense of loss. Ananda knew the truth about the passing of the Master. Therefore, he did not suffer. Buddha knew the mystery of all things that change, and therefore the transition is to be met in peace and understanding and charity and insight and kindness and forgiveness. He also taught that every grudge can be likened to a psychological germ bringing sickness to those who hold it. Every prejudice, every unreasonable attitude, any pressureful or extreme attitude, even one of a highly spiritual nature, must be carefully examined. Where the person loses his inner poise and expresses an emotion or an attitude that is excessive, there is too much pressure. And what is pressure? Pressure is a cause of suffering. Wherever there is pressure, there will be suffering. Now, nature has provided man with a certain equipment to protect him from suffering. He has resources within the endocrine system, particularly in the suprarenals, which enable him to meet a stressful situation with poise and dignity. But if this stress goes on year by year and he never controls himself, the resources of the body are exhausted and it begins to fail under an abuse of attitudes. Man can destroy his own body by abusing with his attitudes that body. So everywhere the individual must learn to reduce stress. I have noticed in talking with people that nearly always they get excited when they're wrong. They become more pressureful. They do not realize this, but they become defensive. If they are right, it needs no defense. The Buddhist philosophy says if you're right, you don't have to defend. If you're wrong, you can't defend. Therefore, keep quiet and behave yourself. This is very useful. It saves energy. And it would probably add from 5 to 10 years to every person's life in a comparatively healthy condition if he would stop abusing his own attitudes. If he would prevent himself from hating, disliking, grudging. If he would stop blaming this and blaming that and settle down to being what he ought to be, his health would improve and would be possible, very likely, to balance the national budget on this point alone. Because think how much we could save in welfare and Medicare and old age pensions if people were happy, busy, and productive to the end of life. It would not be the same type of world. And we are wearing out this world by simply abusing every resource there is in it. And then when we try to correct the situation, everyone hates us and organizes to maintain the corruptions. Therefore, you cannot do it that way. The only way you can do it is to recognize an over-government or an over-world that must be obeyed. In Buddhism, as Dr. Anasaki, who is an expert on Buddhist symbolic art in Japan, observed, the universe of Buddhism is not a kingdom. The universe of Buddhism is a commonwealth. Buddhism does not teach a tyranny of executive force anywhere in the universe. It is indeed a commonwealth which is created as it is created in order that it may gradually become a psychically socialized existence. The commonwealth of the world, of the universe, of cosmos, is also interpreted in the forms of a cosmotheism, namely that existence itself, this vast expanse, is all of it an expression of the divine mind. The universal thought produces it all. The universal thought is eternal and can never be wrong. The universal thought has unfolded through every form of life that is known to us. Every thought, every form is one of the temporary, passing, musings of an eternal thinker. This vast theism is absolutely organized, but it is organized not by an artificial mind forcing organization upon it. It is organized because every atom is organized in its own structure. Organization is inherent in any structure that exists in nature, from the smallest microbe to the vastest galaxy. These things do not have law and order thrust upon them by an external power. That law and order of their kind is within themselves, eternal, inevitable, unchangeable. And that law and order asks and requires and demands the fulfillment of its own purpose. And when the law and order in the living things becomes the rule of those things grow, live, and fulfill themselves. When they go against the plan is so much bigger than they are that they do not have a chance of success. They can never succeed except by obeying not somebody else's will, but the eternal within themselves, which is properly integrated for the species to which they belong. Humanity has its own laws. It has its own rights. It has its own purposes. And these are inherent in every human being. They're in every cell of the body and in the great compound of the cells which we call the personality. All these things are moved by rules which are intended for only one purpose, to prevent suffering. If man himself continues to abuse these rules and causes suffering, then the rules still operate because they begin to point out the law and the path that leads to the end of suffering. The individual who suffers from a mistake must recover by correcting the mistake. If you have a certain physical ailment that is annoying or something, you go to your doctor and he tells you not to do this or to do that, and you will feel better. In nature, you don't get someone telling you, but through experience, you make a mistake and it hurts. You make a mistake in selecting of a friend, and the friend isn't true to you. And you must ask yourself, what caused you to select for your friend a person who wasn't worthy? And the chances are 100 to 1. You will find that you chose that person because that person apparently was going to be serviceable to you for some purpose. That you made the friend to advantage something of your own, and therefore you were deceived. You deceived yourself by allowing your motives to blind you to your integrities. All these things become part of a strong Buddhist philosophy of life. They are part of the way in which the doctrine has descended, and probably will, in one way or another, be absorbed into practically every culture that we know. It conspires against nothing. It is not basically a creed. It doesn't even need to be named. It is not something that was dreamed up by a person. It is merely the ability of the individual to understand his own nature and to find out how he operates by watching himself operate. He must serve apprentice to his own principles in order to learn. And when he sees that he is not getting the results that are good for him, he must change his ways. And he will find nearly always that when he realizes that he needs to change his ways, what he ought to do will become apparent to him. Nature is not a tyrant. It is a very generous and indulgent power. But it has a great project, and that project is to perfect all creation and bring it back again into harmony with an infinite eternal plan. So that in order to fulfill these purposes, each rational thing has to work out its own salvation with diligence. These were the last words of the Buddha. And we all have to live by them. Work out our own salvation, not necessarily for our own glory, but in order that we may become part of a plan that needs us. Every single human being is part of a plan. And that plan calls for the fulfillment of life in everything, the final achievement of the rectification of character in every living thing. The birds and the bees and the animals have their characters which must be rectified. Man has his character. And according to the Buddhist beliefs, the universe is full of unfolding evolutionary processes, where millions and myriads of forms of life unfolding and perfecting themselves according to the laws of existence. To discover these laws is the first labor of the wise. To live them is the first constructive relationship that we can have with eternal purposes. And if we do these things and do them correctly, our lives will be far more gentle. The only thing we have to do is gradually weed out those actions of our own which are detrimental to us and others. And by doing this, we shall come in the end to a very much better and happier relationship with ourselves and with those around us, and we can build a civilization that has a chance of enduring. Well, I guess that's all for this morning.